I'm Dr. Robert Young. I'm welcome you to the fifth presentation of this year's UBC Okanagan Distinguished Speakers Series. I'm happy to be chair of the Distinguished Speakers Series, and my day job is actually as an associate professor in Earth and Environmental Sciences. The intention of the Distinguished Speakers Series is to provide opportunities for our community to hear from people with important insights and unique perspectives. We wish to recognize and thank Dr. Irving K. Barber, whose tremendous commitment to post-secondary education in British Columbia established the Irving K. Barber School of Arts and Sciences Endowment, which has made this series possible. So, first off, welcome to our university campus. This is a fitting venue to hear from one of today's leaders in his academic field of physics, and a highly acclaimed leader in the challenging role of teaching science. Our distinguished speaker, Dr. Carl Wieman, is a professor of physics and director of the Carl Wieman Science Education Initiative at UBC. He shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2001 and is a recipient of the National Science Foundation's Distinguished Teacher Scholarship Award. Dr. Wieman was named U.S. University Professor of the Year in 2004 by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and he currently chairs the National Academy of Sciences Board of Science Education. Dr. Wieman received the prestigious Ørsted Medal almost exactly a year ago from the American Association of Physics Teachers. The list of awards and accolades could go on for a very long time, but I know Dr. Wieman would prefer his time to be given to his very important message today. So the title of today's talk is Using Tools of Science to Teach Science. So with that, please welcome Dr. Wieman.
I'm happy to be here and want to talk today about teaching science and what we've learned and about how to do it in different ways. But before I get into the real heart of this, I want to emphasize that the fact I have a Nobel Prize gets me invited to give talks like this, but it gives me no credit. You know, you shouldn't pay any attention to what I have to say because of that. I mean, the fact is, once one gets a Nobel Prize, you're automatically considered an expert on everything, no matter how little you actually know about the subject. And so, you know, a Nobel Prize in physics doesn't mean anything about education, but the reason you should pay attention to what I have to say is because it's really backed up by lots of good data. And this is research data from people in a variety of fields, as you'll see, from really all over the world. A little bit of this actually comes from my own science education research group that I've had now for about 10 years, working primarily in physics and some in chemistry. And it's that data which really is, I think, what justifies the ideas I'm going to talk about today. So what I'm going to cover today is first, why we should care about science education, and then second, spend most of my time looking at what research tells us about the effectiveness of traditional science education and how it can be improved. And then I want to get into some of the toys, some of the technology that can actually help achieve this. And I don't really think I'll take time today to get into what the initiative is at UBC. That's more kind of a university change issue. So I want to start by talking about the purpose and importance of science education, because I and many other people believe that it's really changed quite a lot in the last 50 years, and that its historical purpose was really to train that tiny fraction of the population that we're going to go on to become scientists. But there's some big societal changes that have modified that, and those two are first, we really face some extremely large and important global scale issues, which are fundamentally technical at their heart. And you all know these. I mean, they're global warming, choice of energy sources, genetic modification, and so on. And if we're going to have a population who are going to make wise decisions on these issues that are going to affect the Earth for thousands of years, they really have to be much more technically and scientifically literate than they are now. And the second is just the changes in the economy. The modern economy is so based on science and technology that really, independent of occupation, there's almost every occupation now having some basic technical literacy and complex problem-solving skills is important for the success of one in a job, and it's important for the economy to prosper. And so because of these two big changes, it means that we can't just worry about those who are going to become scientists. We have to worry about making science education effective and relevant for a large fraction of the population. Now, those of you who are scientists, I should comfort you a little bit and say, well, the next generation of scientists still are important, but all of our research tells us that if we make it better for everyone, we'll actually produce more and better scientists at the same time. So we don't have an either-or situation. Okay, so I said we've got to make an effective science education, but what do I really mean by effective education? What I would argue in an effective education is really transforming how students think. So they come into our classrooms like this, and we want them to go out, basically transformed, like this. Now, admittedly, we don't really expect them to all turn into scientists like these two right away, but I would argue that a good measure is whatever the course and program you'd like to have accomplish, having students think about and using science more like a scientist does. And that's the standards by which I evaluate, and I and others are really evaluating the effectiveness of education. And to try and achieve this for a large fraction of the population is really a completely unprecedented educational challenge. Nobody's done this, demonstrated this anywhere, anytime. And so we're facing really a completely new issue. And one could even question whether it's possible. But the hypothesis that I and many other people are putting forward is that it is possible to accomplish this, but to accomplish it, we have to really start thinking about the teaching of science like a science itself. And that really gets back to the title of my talk, because I think this really hinges on taking tools and methods that have been so effective and so much at the heart of the development of science and applying those to science education. And some of the examples I'll give here are things that any experimental scientist would recognize as something they think about and use every day in their research. And I'm going to show you how you can use those in education as well. So the first is just the practices and conclusions based on good objective data. In education, data on what students are really learning. Being guided by fundamental research. Here I would say research on what we know about how people learn. Disseminating, things in a scholarly manner. So when we find out, you get results showing that things work, make sure those are spread around and copied. And, in science, if I go to work on a new research project, I start out by reading the literature. It tells me exactly what the latest findings and methods are, and I can build that, and so I just copy that, and then I move forward above that. beyond that. And in education, we have the habit of each new instructor sort of reinventing things each course they take. And so I'd say we need to approach this the way we do science, of copying what works, and then finally, of course, just utilizing modern technology to its best effect. And if we do this, I'm going to argue that we can dramatically improve both the efficiency and effectiveness of education. And the rest of my talk is going to be giving you examples to back that up. So I'm going to move now to looking at research. And there, like I say, over the past 10 to 20 years, there's been a great advance in the research on understanding how people learn, understanding how people learn science, more effective ways to teach science. Much of this is coming from people like myself, who are scientists in the disciplines, who are actually then studying how to educate people more effectively in those fields. But before I get into the details of the research studies, I want to give a little perspective of how I came to think about this in a different way, and how I came to see there was a different way to approach science. And it really starts with how I used to teach science. And when I was first called upon to teach physics in introductory classes, I took the same approach that I think is just kind of a human basic reaction to teaching anything. And that is, I took I think it was electricity, the first class I had to teach, and so I thought very hard about this subject, and I got it figured out really clearly in my own mind, and so that I could go and explain it to the students so they could all understand it with the same clarity I had. Well, that was the theory. The result, though, if one thing, I always believe in measuring things. I'm a hardcore experimental scientist. When I would actually measure what my students were learning, and frankly, other people's students, what I saw is that, with a few rare exceptions, my brilliantly clear explanations left the great majority of these students just baffled. It just wasn't working. And for many years, this was just kind of a frustrating puzzle to me. It wasn't clear to me it was possible to teach effectively. But what led me to think about this, to understand this better, was actually graduate students. Because I've had a long, successful career doing atomic physics research. And that kind of research really involves working very closely with a large number of students. They really do all the work. And so I spent a lot of time worrying about their training and development as scientists. And over the years, I saw a very consistent pattern start to emerge. And the first part of the pattern was that these students would come in as new or second-year graduate students, come in to work in my research lab. And they were graduate students in physics, so they had, by definition, had 17 years of great success in all their science courses. And yet, they were really clueless about actually how to do physics when I put them in the research lab. Well, that was the first part. But then, just a few years of working in the research lab, they had suddenly transformed into expert physicists. They were winning arguments with me all the time and explaining things to me. Now, if I'd just seen this happen in one or two cases, I would have thought, gee, that's just kind of surprising, isn't it? But when I saw it happening over and over again, it was clear there was a pattern here, and there was something more fundamental going on. And so after a while, I decided, I have to go and figure this out. And, there's just a puzzle here that has to be explained. And so one possibility that came to mind, and one that comes to mind of I've had many other people suggest this who've seen similar things, is, well, maybe the human brain just has to go through sort of, a 17-year caterpillar stage before it can suddenly be transformed into a physicist butterfly. And maybe that was the explanation. So, and that's a reasonable possibility, but that wasn't really good enough for me. And so I really set out in a systematic way to look at what the research was on how people learn and how people learn science to see if I could make sense of this. And after I looked at lots of studies, I came to realize that in fact, this wasn't the explanation, but in fact, this pattern made complete sense. And in understanding it, it also showed how there was a tremendous opportunity to improve our normal science classes. And so that's really the history of how I went to go through this. And now I'm going to give you some of the data and studies that led me to see things in this new light. And so I'm going to look at some data on the effectiveness of traditional science teaching with a little bit of discussion on implications for how they improve this. Now, what I mean by traditional science teaching is the way the vast number of science classes here and everywhere else are taught. And basically, that means the primary contact between student and instructor is instructor standing up like this, except usually they have a chalkboard, lecturing to a largely passive group of students, and then the students go home and they do homework problems from the back of the chapter in the textbook, and they have similar kinds of exams. And that's basically the way it works, and probably all of you have experienced this. And so, as I say, people have now started systematically, seriously studying how much students are actually learning from this. And I've picked intentionally 3 very different kinds of learning to just look at, examine various aspects of this. One is just retention of information from lecture. 2 is developing an understanding of basic concepts. And the 3rd is just general beliefs about what physics is and how you go about solving problems. So, and then I'm going to talk about research from cognitive science on expert competence and how it's developed. And so you can understand, it sort of gives us a better understanding of why we see the results we do in these classroom studies. Now, I should say that most of what I'm going to show you today the data comes from studies on introductory university physics. That's partly because that's what I know the most about. But it's a better reason than that is that's where most of the good research has been done. But there's a rapidly growing amount of similar research coming from all different grade levels and different disciplines, and it's all having a very consistent pattern, what I'm going to show you today. Okay, so the first is looking at retention of information from lecture. Now, if you think about what the basic idea of a lecture is, it's to transfer information from one to many. And it turns out it's pretty easy to measure just how well that works. And so this is something that any of you that are teachers could go and do yourself in your own classes. You need to have a strong stomach, I'll warn you, but you could repeat these easily. And so there's more structured things. I'm just going to give you 2 that have been done in real classrooms by real teachers that are quite compelling. The first comes from Joe Reddish. Joe is a physics professor at the University of Maryland and is really considered one of their really outstanding lecturers. The students love him, say he's great, all the faculty look to him. But he's a thoughtful guy, and he started wondering, how much are my students really learning, though? And so he hired physics graduate students to catch the students as they left the class at the end of the lecture and interview them on, just to ask them, what was the lecture you heard? What was it about? And what he discovered by doing that was that consistently the students could answer only in the vaguest of generalities. They could hardly tell them anything about what the lecture actually covered. Now, in some small studies that I did with Kathy Perkins back when we were giving regular traditional lectures, we started making a habit of taking a number of examples where after we'd presented some non-obvious important fact in the lecture, normally with some kind of illustration, we would just test the students how many remembered that 15 minutes later. And what we found was that typically 10%, sometimes less, would actually remember this idea they'd been told. Now, you know, especially if you're a teacher or you have a child who's a student, you ought to be thinking, oh my God, can this possibly be true? Can this really apply to many, to all science lectures, this result that students are getting so little information out of them? And I would argue that almost certainly this is a general result, and I would argue it based on one of the best experimentally established and widely ignored results in cognitive science. And it has to do with something people talk about is cognitive load. And this is actually quite nicely represented by this cartoon. I don't know if you can read that from the back, but the student saying, "Mr. Anderson, may I be excused? My brain is full." And the reason this is such a good representation is it refers to the fact that the what's called the working memory, that's the part of the brain that deals with remembering and processing on relatively short time scales, like an hour-long, physics class, that has extremely limited capacity. That's in comparison with the long-term memory, which has enormous capacity. This working memory, though, has very little capacity, and the more you put in it, the less the whole brain can function and process. It's very analogous to a computer without very much RAM in it. How more windows you open, everything bogs down. And it turns out the brain's the same. Now, what cognitive scientists will tell us from their research labs is that the typical human brain in this short-term working memory can remember a maximum of about 7 items, and it can process a maximum of about 4 ideas at once. Now, exactly what these mean, an item and idea, mean when you transfer from their lab setting to a science classroom are a little fuzzy, but the one thing that's absolutely clear is that this is just a tiny capacity compared to the amount of ideas and processing a student is routinely expected to do within a normal science lecture. And so that's why I think it's quite clear that it would be really surprising to see anything but the kind of things I showed where students can take away such a small fraction of the information they've been given. The brain simply doesn't have the capacity to do that. Now, I should say in that spirit, and since I know that I'm going to violate this in this talk, I'll make sure that you've got long-term memory capacity by making sure people have copies of my slides here if you want to get them later and remind yourself what was in there. Okay, so that's just retention of information from lecture. One could reasonably argue that's not super important. There's a lot deeper thinking, abilities we want students to master. And so one of those is conceptual understanding, being able to understand and apply concepts. That's much more at the heart of what we think is important learning in science. And because of that, quite a lot of people have studied this in physics. And in the process, they've developed some very carefully developed research tests for probing how well students are learning concepts. And the oldest and most widely used is something called the Force Concepts Inventory. It looks at what are the key concepts of force and motion that are covered in every first semester physics course everywhere at any, there's an enormous consistency of this across the world. And so it's easy to develop a test and measure and use it in lots of places. And basically, what this test does, it takes the basic concepts of force and motion and tests how well students understand them by having them apply them in some simple real-world situation, like a car running into a truck, or this is one of the questions from this test of this is a tube sitting on a desk, you got a ball rolling around inside it, what direction does it go as it comes out? And so the way this test is then used is you give it to the students at the beginning of the term, the first, the physics course that covers these ideas. You give it at the beginning of the term, and then you give it to them after they've successfully completed the course, and you see what fraction of the questions they got wrong at the beginning have they learned by the time they in the course. And so, this is what we call their learning gain. And this is now routinely given in hundreds of courses across the continent every year to measure this. And so we have a lot of data, and that data shows a very consistent pattern. This is just one compilation from, I think you probably can't see this, but it's a published result where he looked at measurements of this gain in a whole bunch of different courses. And what he did was he looked at the average. So he took the learning gain for all the students in the course, the average amount they gained, the average amount they learned, and then compiled, checked the different institutions, different class sizes, people were considered good lecturers, bad lecturers, et cetera, and looked and saw how much this varied. And what he got is a very robust result, which there's lots of other data showing the same thing now. And that is that basically in the traditional lecture course, students the average student never masters as more than 30% of these essential concepts they didn't know at the beginning of the course. And so this is a really striking result because, as I say, this holds up for giant classes, tiny classes, Harvard University, local two-year college, et cetera. And it really says that the traditional lecture approach simply is not very effective at having students learn concepts in physics. Now, the things I'm going to tell you about, the approaches I'm going to tell you about later, in large part driven by this test and these results, people develop new different approaches which are now consistently getting results up in here. So 2 to 3 times better learning gains. Okay, I'm going to now switch to a completely different kind of learning. It doesn't really have to do with the content directly at all. It's basic beliefs about science and how science is learned and used. And it turns out, and this is something my own research group is one of the leading leaders in. And it turns out if you interview a whole lot of people, including students, you find out you can classify their beliefs on these areas between what we call a novice and expert. And the labels, what those define those labels as, a novice, say in their views about physics, they see the content of physics as just isolated little pieces of information, and you learn physics just by memorizing that information. They see this information being completely disconnected from the world outside the classroom and is just handed down by the authority of the professor or the textbook. And they see physics problem solving as just using memorized recipes and just looking for the pattern of the problem and matching that with the right recipe. And if you think about it, that isn't good for much more than passing physics tests in useful learning. Now, experts, like practicing physicists, they see the content as and I mean, this is physicists or chemists, whatever, it's a consistent pattern here. But they see the content of the subject as this coherent structure of general concepts. These concepts describe nature, they're established by experiment. And expert problem solving involves systematic concept-based strategies, which are widely applicable, including into completely new situations, and that makes them much more useful. So once you realize people's beliefs lie in a scale like this, you can develop attitudinal surveys, and that's what we've done, that allows you to measure where students are. And so you can, you measure at the start of a course, they're, the average student somewhere in here towards the maybe somewhat in the novice side, so this allows you to then measure how much more expert-like their beliefs become as a result of taking these courses, okay? And so we've now done this in lots of courses, and other people have taken our surveys and also used it all over the place. And what we find out is consistently, they don't move up at all. In fact, that almost all introductory physics courses, except for a few experimental ones that I'll tell you about, leave the students more novice-like in their beliefs as a result of taking the course than they were before they ever started, okay? Now, we've now extended this work to chemistry, developed appropriate tools for measuring that. We're seeing, if anything, introductory chemistry is even worse than physics, okay? And we're starting on biology, and for any biologists in the room, you better be worried. Okay, so this is a pretty scary result in many respects, particularly if you think about, if you're concerned about the anti-science movement, because if you kind of think of what has to be behind somebody who can have these kind of anti-science beliefs, they basically are these very novice beliefs about science itself. And the fact is, we're teaching those to students without ever realizing it. So my group has studied quite a lot about this. I don't have time to go into the studies, but we do see these beliefs are connected with the learning, the content of learning. We see they're a very powerful filter about people's choices of what subject they're going to major in and whether they stay in that major. And I want to emphasize that these don't have anything to do with ability. They're much more analogous to religious beliefs, that they're shaped by people's experiences and they can be easily shifted around. So the fact that we're deciding who goes into science by something that's, that's such an important factor of deciding that has nothing to do with measuring their ability is really quite, one should be worrying about that. Now, we do a lot of research looking at how these teaching practices affect these students' beliefs, because that's where you make a difference. And so we've been looking a lot at this. As I pointed out, we see this significant decline in physics and chemistry, and we also see those are directly connected, for obvious reasons, with actually decreased interest in the subject as well. But the good news is that although this is quite new and we've only just started to explore this, with even our first attempts, we find that you can avoid these declines just by recognizing and explicitly addressing the student beliefs. And to do that just means as one's presenting material, whatever topic it is, being quite explicit telling the students not just the facts, but talking about why this material is worth learning, how does it connect to the real world, and how does it connect to things that the student already knows, and why does it make sense? And doing nothing more, not changing anything beyond trying to put a, explicit connection on those we see consistently makes a significant improvement. Now, I won't say we don't know enough to be able to claim that we've improved their beliefs greatly, but we at least don't have them decline, and sometimes they improve a little. We'll be learning more about how to actually improve them in the future. Okay, so I've covered these 3 different areas, but in particular emphasis on the last 2, where talked about how courses which are completely concept-based in their instruction, introductory physics, all about these concepts, how students aren't learning the concepts. They're being taught by experts, and yet the students are coming away less expert-like in their beliefs. These are troubling, but it turns out they're not surprising. If you look at cognitive science research, you can understand why this is happening. And in particular, there's a lot of research in cognitive science looking at expert competence. What makes up expert competence in any area of expertise, and how is it developed? And it turns out there's some very consistent things that emerge. And in particular, in components of expert competence, there's 3 main things. The first is really obvious. Experts know a lot. They have a lot of knowledge about their subject. But there's some others that aren't so obvious. The second is experts have unique mental organizational structures for their knowledge that allows them to retrieve it and apply it very effectively. And then the third is experts have an ability to monitor their own thinking, at least in their area of expertise. And by that I mean they can ask themselves, do I understand this? How can I check that? Is this way of solving a problem making sense? And this is, if you're familiar sometimes with the term, this is called metacognitive or metacognition. Now, what the cognitive scientists tell us is that, now let me go back and say that, okay, once you realize these features, you can understand what the problem is with the traditional science instruction, because the implicit assumption there is if we give the students the information, they'll develop automatically these other expert-like ways of thinking. Now, we saw in those classroom studies that doesn't happen, and that's exactly what the cognitive scientists also tell us from their studies that you'd expect, because these things in yellow are really new ways of thinking, new ways for the brain to process information. And they don't develop without extended, focused mental effort with that brain to actually construct the ability to do that kind of processing. They also tell us that these ways of thinking are always built on the prior thinking of the person, the knowledge and thinking of the person. And so to develop effectively, that prior thinking has to be taken into account. And if parts of it are messed up or not what you need, they have to be addressed before you can move on to develop effectively more expert-like ways of thinking. Now, I think we now know enough about how the brain works and develops. You can make a pretty strong argument that these are really very fundamental in the sense of basic biology at their heart now. And it's just because of the reason I can make that claim is that everything we think of as expertise is in the long-term memory of the brain. That's where it sort of lives. And we know that these things are required in long-term memory development, to basically build those little proteins and make those structures that make up the long-term memory. So I think there's no real way around this. It's just the way the brain, the biology of the brain itself. And so, okay, now with these insights, this original puzzle that troubled me so much, I think clearly makes lots of sense, because this happened because we see that traditional science courses are simply poor at developing expert-like ways of thinking. And this makes sense because if you look at what all of this research on learning and expert competence says, it says that there's this basic principle that people learn by creating their own understanding, and that effective teaching is really just the facilitation of that creation of understanding, and that facilitation happens by getting them engaged in thinking deeply about the subject, trying to solve problems, and then monitoring and guiding their thinking. Now, that's exactly what happens in a typical physics research lab. And it happens all the time, day after day after day. And so it's not that there's some magical thing in the atmosphere in my lab. It just tells us that it's the type of cognitive processes which have been shown to be critical for developing expert-like thinking are what one has going on continually in the research lab. And so once you recognize that, at least this was what I felt, once I realized that, I could see that, okay, that tells us how we can improve classroom instruction. We just have to make sure that we have the proper cognitive processes going on in the regular classrooms. And so, I've been working on this, but a lot of other people had figured this out before me, and they'd also been doing lots of research on this. And I don't have time to cover all the research on better ways to do this. I'll give some basic summaries, but I do want to give you some data showing this really does work. And just to compare, so this is sort of taking that basic principle and applying it in the classroom. What kind of differences can we get? Well, we've seen dramatic improvements in retention of information from lecture. We've seen, as I mentioned before, these gains in conceptual learning, doubling, sometimes even tripling. And we've seen at least small improvements in these beliefs compared to substantial decline. So the data says, we now have considerable data, been repeated many times, saying this really works. So I'm going to turn in, like I say, try and give you a very quick summary of sort of what we know about effective pedagogy now from this research. And like I said, it's sort of, it's the most simplified version is you got to get them thinking, then you've got to monitor and guide that thinking. It's now actually, the more people understand about learning, the more, and the brain, the more they realize that learning is, the more they see it, how it's closer and closer to muscle development. If you want to develop a muscle, you've got to exert it, strenuously, and you've got to do that a lot of times for an extended period. And it turns out that's what we see now is the same way of learning. You've got to have the brain strenuously exerted, and you've got to do that over a long period of time. But one difference between a muscle is, well, a little bit, if I want to develop a muscle, it helps if people tell me if I'm exerting the right muscle. And so in the brain, that's what we need in teaching, is you got to monitor and guide them. Otherwise, it's a lot harder to learn. And so I want to talk about, okay, so how does one do that in the classroom, and what are some important things? The first is you have to know where they're starting from to connect up with that, because otherwise your teaching can be completely ineffective. People always interpret what they hear in light of what they've already known, and so this is kind of an essential starting point. You have to get them actively processing the ideas. In the modern, university, the primary contact between student and instructor happens in the classroom, so one has to think about ways to make this happen in the classroom, and that's, and then how you can probe and guide their thinking in the classroom. But that isn't enough. And I want to stress this because so many, even very thoughtful teachers, realize this. They put a lot of effort into thinking about that. And then they just kind of, okay, they toss off some homework maybe students should be working on. And the reason I want to, and they're missing a key point, which is that we know it's absolutely essential for learning that there's no shortcut to the amount of time put into this strenuous development. And so you've got to think of what happens in the classroom as just kind of a good starting point. It has to be built on with extended periods of time, which normally come in the form of homework, that really continue to focus the students on developing these expert-like thinking of skills, or expert-like thinking, and that they get feedback on their effectiveness. And I stress this because no matter how fantastic a job you do in the classroom, basic biology says the brain can't build enough little proteins and put them together right to develop robust long-term memory. And it just requires more time to do that. And so that's why this is so critically important. Okay, so let me move on to some things one can do on how to actually accomplish this engagement and processing and feedback in the classroom. Now, I think probably anybody who's taken the trouble to show up to this talk is thoughtful enough about teaching and learning. They could figure out how to do this with 1 or 2 students. In the modern university, you got to figure out how to do it with 200 students. And that's where technology, I think, is, if not, it's certainly very helpful. It's arguably completely essential. But it has to be used right. There's lots of ways to use technology wrong. And so this is something that my group, and as well as others, have been looking at. And I want to give you 2 examples of technologies that we have good evidence can be very powerful in accomplishing this. The first is what I call the interactive lecture, really facilitated by these personal response systems. And then the second thing is online interactive computer simulations. So let me first talk about this idea of concept questions and clickers or personal responses. First, how many people here are familiar with personal response systems? Okay, so a few, but most of you aren't. Okay, so here's an example of one of them. Like I say, the students all call them clickers, so that's what I usually do. If you can see, there's 5 little buttons here, A, B, C, D, and E, and F. And so the way I would use these in a class is every student would have them, and each individual clicker is coded to that student. And so I would pose a question to the class. For example, this one, if I was teaching about electric currents and voltage, I'd pose, okay, when I close this switch, that bulb, what's going to happen to the brightness of that bulb, okay? And so students think about that, and then they pick which answer they think, and this student pushes the appropriate button. And then there's a receiver on the computer, and it records each individual student's identity and what answer they chose. And then normally the way these are used is you show, after everybody's put in their answer, then you show the class the histogram of what the responses were, on that question. Now, I want to emphasize that clickers are like any technology. They're not automatically helpful. They don't automatically solve problems. You have to really think about them just as a way to extend the capabilities of the instructor to accomplish these educational goals. And I've unfortunately, as I go around the world talking to people about this, I see that very often they're just being used and being seen by the students that they're being used just as expensive ways, expensive to the students. They usually have to pay for these things, they're around $50 to $60. Just an expensive way to take attendance and occasionally give them simple tests. And if you do that, they don't have much effect on student learning, and they have a lot of effect on student grumpiness. But if they're used right to really enhance this engagement and communication between the students and the instructor, then they really can be quite transformative on a class. And so some of the key things so my group and the people that I'm working with in these science education initiatives have done a lot to introduce and develop effective use of these things. Some of the key things, if people here are thinking about using them, make sure that your questions are hard. That's important. Challenging things that have the students really thinking. Second, student-student discussion is really beneficial. So in fact, normally I wouldn't just pose a question like that. I would put up the question, have students think about it for a little while by themselves. And then in the classes that are most effective, you actually have assigned consensus groups in the class. So for example, those 4 people right there would be part of a group. Each time they'd have to sit there, come in together, and then on this question, they'd have to talk to each other and argue about what the right answer was and why. And basically that kind of discussion does all kinds of valuable learning things, including, and possibly most important, well, not most important, but they get a lot out of the discussion. But as an instructor, you get enormous amounts of discussion because you can go and listen in on these conversations and find out which things students are really confused and completely mixed up about, or what they've got basically right. And then the follow-up discussion by the instructor allows you to bring out exactly what the students are thinking is right and where they're confused, and directly target that confusion and help and guide the students beyond it. And that's what really then changes the dynamics of the classroom and can make these things much more effective. And so now you're really communicating and interacting in an effective way with a large fraction of the students at once, just because of using this technology that you couldn't do otherwise. Okay, let me finish up with just a thing that I have a big group, or not a big group, but it's been running a long time. I'm looking at interactive simulations. This is a completely new educational media that we've been working on developing and studying. And these are things they run online. So there can be run they're these simulations run over a regular browser. And we make them and test them and then put them up on the web for free so anybody can get to them going to this website. But we have a lot of these now on a whole range of topics in physics and a growing number in chemistry. And they range from very simple ones like the balloon and sweater that I'll show you, up to a bunch in quantum physics. This is a very accurate model of a laser. And so let me just show you an example of, okay, so this one, the simplest ones. You can get a flavor for how these work. So in this, you use a mouse to grab the balloon and rub it on the sweater. And you see it picks up electric charges. And now, because there's an imbalance in the electric charges, you see the attraction. And if I rub harder, I get more and stronger. Can take this over to the wall. See how how it affects the charges in the wall and how that results in it sticking to the wall as long as it's really close, and otherwise it gets pulled back here. So this is just one example of quite a simple, but one that's quite educationally powerful. A more complicated one that's actually very widely used now is the circuit construction kit. And in this, you can build pretty much any circuit you want out of basic AC and DC components, except transistors. And so I built most of this ahead of time. I just have one more wire to hook up here. So now I've hooked up the last wire. Nothing happens because I haven't closed the switch. I close the switch. The electrons start moving. The light bulb lights up. I can go and increase the voltage in the battery, and the electrons move faster and the light bulb gets brighter. There's all kinds of other features you can have, like we've got meters, so you can measure the voltage at different places around this circuit and see what values they have. Okay, so there's all kinds of different things you can do with this. And like I say, we've done a lot of research on these as well as spending a lot on developing them. And we have data showing they're very powerful learning tools in different settings for very different ranges. And I just want to summarize by sort of using them as an excuse to summarize what's really been found out in educational research in general, because this shows up as we test these with students. We see these basic features that have seen in many other different settings very consistently. First, it's that the students, it's not that they're just uninformed. It's that their brains really are different. They think and perceive differently from experts, and that the understanding is really created by them thinking about things and changing their brains. And to do that, it's not sufficient to just get their attention. They have to be working to actively figure things out, and they get feedback on how successful they're doing at figuring things out. You know, normal instruction, that would be provided by the teacher. Here we have the simulation. But in any case, when that's accomplished, that's when they really master the subject. And so I'll end with that. And just here, if you want to learn more about this, here's a bunch of references starting with the longest and best written book up at the top here to the shortest and worst written down at the bottom.
I've noticed that a lot of children's toys and sort of things that they're coming up with these days are a lot more interactive and that sort of thing. I just want to know, like, what you think about that and how that aids development leading into.
You know, it's hard for me to make sweeping generalizations about children's toys. I mean, I'd have to more look at detailed ones, but, you know, what we know is anything that really has people to think and analyze and make sense of stuff, whether it's a 6-year-old or whether it's a 25-year-old, whether it's a 50-year-old, is an important aspect of development. Now, what we do know is that it's not enough to just get attention, okay? And if you didn't believe that, just look at television. But we see this in our simulation, you know, just playing with something because it's fun because there's balls flying around. We know that isn't going to make much of an effect. But if it's something where they have challenges to figure out why the balls go there, or have to change things that make them land here rather than other places, that almost certainly is aiding their mental development.
I'm a high school teacher, and I wonder that, like you said, it takes not just to get the attention, but they have to actually do effortful, spend time thinking about these things. Do you think this has your research has implications for curriculum? Like, are we trying to put too much maybe in the curriculum? Rather, should we look for more depth rather than width?
Yeah, this is something that everybody who ever looks at this, is very clear that, the curriculum, the more you stand up there and tell people stuff, the faster you can get through the material and the less they learn. And so where you go into depth, I mean, it takes time for people to, there's a reason that, we didn't understand biology and physics for thousands of years, right? These are hard ideas to really make sense of them, to get that serious intellectual mastery. It takes time. They have to be posing questions, trying to figure them out, getting feedback. You can't do that if you're going to cover 85 topics in an hour. And the other thing is the brain can't handle it anyway, the last 78 of those.
I was just thinking about how a typical semester for a bachelor student is organized, particularly in the first few years where they're taking an English course and a biology and a physics.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could imagine for us how a semester or a program might look for a bachelor student using these principles. Would things need to be reorganized so that one topic is focused on for longer?
I can't really tell. I just don't know. That hasn't, we've got good research on learning particular things and what experiment with particular classes. I don't know of any good systematic research that would give us guidance on telling us how to structure the whole day and program for a student. I just don't know the answer to that. It's an extremely worthwhile, interesting question. I think we can extrapolate from what we do know about cognitive science enough to know that having students go through 6 straight hours of courses, one after the other in a day, just isn't going to do it because the brain can't handle it. But in terms of going beyond that to saying, well, what should be the optimum design? I don't think anybody knows that. I think it's an important experimental question.
You're also up against the inertia of every institution teaches a 4-year degree. You've got 120 credits, you've got 40 courses, you have 1,200 hours of instruction, and they need to know thousands of years of their discipline at the end of those 4 years. And yet, we should only be telling them 7 things a class, and we need to give them time to figure out stuff for themselves.
Right.
So how do we break the inertia of an institutional 4-year degree and still have them actually learn everything we would love them to learn?
So the response let me answer that question at a much smaller level of, okay, let's take, first year chemistry as an example, because, I'm just going to break it down. You can take any given course, you have the same question, right? And so, yeah, these things take longer, these interactive classes. So there's a couple of approaches one can take to deal with this. One of them is that recognizing that students can learn things without you covering them during a lecture. And in fact, that's a very valuable skill. And so one of the things I do is, in my own courses, is I go through and have these highly interactive classes where they're taught to think, and then I send them off to do homework on topics they haven't covered. We don't cover in class, but they recognize and are capable of actually figuring out. So that's one part of the solution. The other part of the solution is to think more sensibly than most faculty have about how much content do we really need students to know? What fraction of this content that we cover are they actually going to use, and how much new learning are they going to have to do, after they walk outside. And when if you make a rational analysis of that, you clearly recognize that it's much more important that they be able to learn to think. And in fact, the details of the content are how they don't really have to cover all of those things. I mean, I use myself as a example very seldom, because I think it's much better to rely on actual research. But I will point out, I never had a course in optics or laser physics, and I never had a course in atomic physics, and I won a Nobel Prize in doing laser physics with atoms. I mean, so yeah, so I think those are the two issues that you have to think about. There's really much more important educational goals than covering 100 different topics.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I have one question as a parent, and that is that I've had two children go through university, and it always surprised me that there's education for teachers at the primary and secondary level on how to teach. But why is there not that specifications for university teachers?
I can't tell you, well, yeah, I can tell you why. I mean, it goes back to what I talked about with expert competence. There's this implicit assumption that facts are all that matter in terms of that's what learning is. And so if that's your basic assumption, then if somebody's an expert in the subject, they know all the facts, then that means they're qualified to teach it at the highest level, okay? So that, there's plenty of research saying that that's just plain wrong. And, I mean, that's part of what my science education initiatives are trying to get at, is make people realize, no, you actually, knowing the facts isn't enough. There's a lot more you have to know to help to be a useful, helpful, effective teacher to make people learn that information. And, it's not an easy thing to change, but it's clearly necessary. Yeah.
Early on in my own career as an academic, I went to a course in London, England, on how to teach better than is normally the case in universities. Mm-hmm. And as far as I could figure out, the whole theme of the course was that lectures are bad things, and you should never lecture, and you should teach in other ways. And the whole course was given by lectures.
Right.
I was kind of delighted to see that you didn't do that. You didn't say lectures are bad, but you can jack up the quality of lectures by making them more interactive, by maybe closing off a lecture with giving a little problem for the next lecture, and so on, and do a little bit of recapping when you need to, etc. Just to help along the process of coaxing the brain to store the information and so on. And I was totally delighted to see that you're a believer that no real learning ever takes place without some hard work and really grappling with the problem yourself. And that was very, very pleasing to me. I just have a final sort of question. Have you discovered that there are at least some professors who kind of automatically do the things that you think ought to be done during the course of the lecture?
Yeah, but I won't say it's automatic. The ones I've seen who are so there's two classifications of quote good professors. Okay, yes. There's the one group who are keep the students very interested, and they love to, they're charismatic and entertaining and so on, and but don't involve the students very much. Now, that's not entirely bad. There's something to be, they certainly can have an impact on generating interest in the subject and students wanting to come to class. But what we know is they aren't very effective at, still getting concepts across. But then there's the other kind of good teacher, and they can actually have both characteristics, but who have thought very carefully and watched their students and talked with their students carefully, and they've introduced many of these ideas without reading any research. They recognize that, yeah, they'll interrupt and they'll pose questions to students. They'll figure out ways to make students have to think, reflect on what they're talking about. They'll prepare them to learn, which when you talk about the usefulness of lectures, I mean, yeah, there's some good research showing that lectures can be quite effective. And frankly, that's my only hope for giving a lecture like this, is that if it's on a subject where the people are quite familiar with the ideas, the background, have some prior thinking, in other words, pretty much experts in the subject, then they can gather a lot from a lecture. They've got, they connect it with their long-term memory and thinking. And so, frankly, I'm hoping that I'm talking mostly to students and academics who've been through this experience, because otherwise a lecture like this is kind of, if I gave this to a bunch of 10-year-olds, they'd all be, it'd be totally waste of time. And
Yes.
it may be a waste of time for many of you, but at least some it isn't. And so the lectures are not guaranteed worthless. You just have to make sure and use them in the right way and the right time.
Thank you.
I'm quite persuaded by your statistics, but I'm less persuaded by the argument about technology and the necessity of technology. And the example I wanted to use is that of the clickers. So you said that you use it to ask a question and then the students respond, but I would imagine that in your lectures before you use the clicker technology that you would ask the question and the students would respond orally, and you might put them into groups and have them, problem solve a question, and then they would respond orally. Why is the clicker technology necessary to achieve those goals?
So we have done, one of the people I work with, Andrea Baer, has done, because the instructors she was working with raised this question directly as, oh, well, it's complicated to use this, I don't want to bother. And they did a quite a specific study in which they gave essentially identical lectures in 2 sections where clickers were used with one, and in fact, the students raising their hands were used in another, okay? And so the reason, and it was overwhelming, that clickers were much more effective by a bunch of different measures. The students said it was much more effective. Attendance was much higher. There's a couple of things that you get, okay? First is individual accountability, okay? If a student has something they know, okay, that what they've, that they're putting in an answer, even if you don't have it mark as a grade, you just look that he did it, okay? They have something they're accountable for, so they take it much more seriously. They think hard and they, get much more involved, as opposed to, and they talk to each other much more. So that's the first thing, is just the students take the exercise much more seriously. The second thing, though, that's not so, isn't so intuitively obvious, but it's that the clickers, the feedback, that histogram, okay? So if I'm asking a class, either verbally to answer or even raising hands, there's very little validity. I can't really tell what they say, because what I know and the students tell me is most of them look around to see who's raising their hands for which thing, then they raise their hand. It doesn't, and so whether a lot of them answer or not, it doesn't really matter. But when that histogram goes up, I know just what fraction of them actually understood this or didn't understand it. And more, a very important aspect is the students know it as well. In our surveys and studies with students, they've told us very clearly that they know that those clicker responses are much more authentic measures. And so boy, if 60% of the class has it wrong, they know that they have shared, you know, that their confusion is shared by lots of other students. They will be much more assertive about raising their hand. You get many more questions. You get students much more willing to say, wait, I don't understand that because it seemed to me this would be right. Whereas raising their hands just doesn't have that authenticity, and so it doesn't get that response. So, like I say, I mean, it's quite a reasonable question, but we've done a very direct study, and it just was completely compelling as to the results.
You've been talking about science, but whether
Yeah.
the methodology you're referring to is being or has been used in the other disciplines, and whether you've looked at that, or whether other disciplines are benefiting from the...
So, it's been done in some other disciplines outside science. Well, boy, if you leave out medical training, the amount of hard research that I'm familiar with is very, very small. Modest amounts in math, but beyond that, I haven't seen it. Now that could partly be my ignorance, but I'm pretty sure that there just isn't very much. At the same time, I think it clearly applies to a lot of subjects, particularly all the things where I sort of tied in with the basic cognitive science research. The cognitive science research in development of expertise and expert competence, that covers many different subjects, and it just, I don't know if people systematically applying it to trying to improve classroom instruction the way it's been done in science. But I'm quite sure that a lot of it, you know, would apply pretty well. But I don't think it's been done as much, and certainly not as much as it could be. Okay.
Great, thanks very much for coming. This is a superb talk. It's, I think, a really important point in our understanding of science education, but I hope it'll just be the beginning of a longer conversation with you into the Institute as you accumulate findings and develop new thoughts. Right now, I'd like to thank Dr. Wieman for coming, and we hope to see him again soon.